All right, everyone, and welcome to the Go 24/7 podcast. My name is Bryce Koon. He is Glen West. And as we wrap up spring positional previews, Glen hustled in from the baseball game that Glen's been a pretty nice weekend for LSU baseball. Offense plenty, especially on Saturday. But, baseball continuing to rock and roll. And I know that the crowd, at least from me watching, the crowd looks really nice out at the box so far.
Yeah, lots of runs scored. They just came off a little two-game sweep of Central Connecticut, outscored them 39-4 in the two games. So definitely the bats got going. They beat Butler 12-2 on Friday, and they get Butler again on Monday. So they're kind of in a weird stretch of their schedule where they play 5 games in 6 days, and then they'll have really start next week on Wednesday and get going. But yeah, their offense is starting to come around. I think their pitching is really taken off these last couple of weeks as well, and they're proven to be one of the best in the country, like we knew coming in. So it's been fun.
It's been a lot of fun, and going back obviously to last Tuesday night in Austin, that game was a fun game to watch, especially if you're a more pitching-oriented baseball viewer, then you really enjoyed that one and what LSU was able to do and find a way to win. That's what you want to do, especially at this juncture.
And SEC field, which is good for this team to get one of those on the road too, which was nice.
Yeah, honestly, Glenn, if I'm not mistaken, the first true road environment they've played in so far this season. So, hey, let's talk linebackers and defensive line today, and I think this is going to be, Glenn, probably the one where I feel we need to see a lot of things in spring practice, but I want to see the coaching staff feel comfortable. Things don't have to be set after April 22nd in the spring game. It doesn't have to be set in stone, but comfortable with the decisions made through the transfer portal. Obviously, people who have followed the transfer portal for LSU know that this is a position, both in kind of that front seven, that they needed to address, and they did. And I think that we talked about early on, it's not just quantity, but they did it with quality as well. It's a good balance, we feel like, but obviously we won't know until we see on the field. So let's start off at this defensive line position, and I want to start right here. Mekhi, Wingo, and Maason Smith, and Glenn, then I'll let you expound on this. I think this has the potential to be the best interior defensive line duo in the country this season. I think they really could live up to that potential. Kind of what are your thoughts on those two?
Yeah, I mean, look, coming into last year, Maason Smith was probably one of the more hyped defensive players in the entire conference last year. You were just really chomping at the bit to see if you could get him on the field. And unfortunately, just goes down with that injury on the very first series of the very first game, and we never got to see him again. And it was just really unfortunate the way that developed. But you got him coming back with Wingo, and I think probably one of the – if there was a silver lining in that injury is that we got to see Mekhi Wingo on the field for practically every snap last year on the interior of that line, and he was really, really good. He doesn't maybe always show in the stats, but he was as good a run stopper of the defense as anybody in the country, and his grades week in, week out kind of proved that. And so you bring that back with what obviously the big play threat, the just kind of mess everything up kind of guy that we believe Maason Smith to be. I think it could be one of the best 1-2 punches on the inside in the entire country. But you got to see it on the field first, and we're still not entirely sure exactly what Maason Smith is going to be able to do this spring. He's been cleared for some stuff from what I'm hearing, and there's a lot of other things that he's still. A lot of benchmarks that he's still got to hit, I think, before we see him out on the field. But I think the fact that he's been ahead of schedule now for several months, I mean, every time we've asked Coach Kelly about him in every press conference in the last couple of months, he is, he's ahead of schedule. And that's pretty much all you can ask for coming back from a severe knee injury like that. And so you take that with what it is, and hopefully we get to see him out there at least a little bit in some capacity this spring.
Now, as good as these two guys can be this year, you can't ask them to shoulder the whole load, especially through an SEC schedule that is grueling and daunting as it is. Now, what left? Obviously, Ali Gay left. Jaquelin Roy is also gone. We saw those two guys perform in the NFL Combine. But what did they bring in? And again, let's kind of start off with some of the transfers here. Jordan Jefferson is a guy that a lot of people really liked in the portal. Glen, LSU was able to nab him. Paris Shand, another guy, a redshirt junior transfer. And then Jalen Lee, a guy that, if I'm not mistaken, wanted to come back closer to home. A guy that was down at Florida, gets to be closer to home. When you look at these defensive linemen, yes, it's okay to be excited about Maason Smith and Mekhi Wingo, and for good reason. You laid it out right there of why we should be. But they can't shoulder the load. And when you look at some of the better defensive lines, the better front sevens that have won the SEC in the past couple of years, look, you go to Athens and see what they had. I mean, it was a gauntlet. You see what Alabama has put out. You go back to the LSU defensive line when they won the national title, not too long ago. And it's depth. So it's quality depth. And that's what they're trying to build here. We've kind of rehashed this theme, throughout this entire little podcast series. How do you feel about some of these incoming transfers and how they maybe fit in to be complementary pieces along this front seven?
Yeah, so we knew that they were going to hit the portal pretty heavy with the defense line because of what they lost last year and a couple of the guys you just mentioned. Jalen Lee and Jordan Jefferson, those are two guys that probably figured to be pegged as interior guys, probably more for depth behind Mekhi and Maason. I would imagine those are that's probably where those two guys wind up, is that interior, 1-2 punch for depth purposes. But it's gonna be more interesting to see what becomes of these edge rushers and who can take the spot left behind by Ali Gay. And obviously with Ojelarvin out, the Jack linebacker spot's going to be open as well. That's pretty much a pure edge rusher with some coverage abilities. But, there's certainly a collection of players there that you're going to be looking at. And Paris Shand is one of them, like you just mentioned. I think you're going to certainly look at Savion Jones, who's going to be a potential edge rush kind of guy that needs to really take on a bigger role next year. Obi Agofu from Texas is a guy that really looks like he could be a big time edge rusher complement for on the outside, and so does Braden Swinson, the edge rusher out of Oregon that you brought in. So definitely a lot of transfers there to kind of cipher through. I think there's they all do different things well, but we'll get a good chance this spring to see kind of how they all mix and match. But those are just a couple of the names there. But certainly one of the big questions I have on this defense kind of heading into spring is what this defensive line kind of shakes out, who steps up in what spots and what scheme they run. I mean, I think a lot of that, people last year, you saw a lot of 4-3 and some 3-4 mixed in as well. But when you've got guys like Wingo and Smith, I think you're going to be looking much more towards that 4-3 kind of model because of how much they're going to need to stay on the field. So that certainly opens up the door for more, physical big edge rushers there that I think a lot of those transfers fit really well into.
Yeah, another name, too, that a lot of fans are going to be excited to see is Dashawn Womack. And this is a guy that came in with a lot of hype, a lot of praise. Sonny Ships talked a lot about him when we do the recruiting podcast as well. But the overall feeling, especially
Womack's a good one for that Jack linebacker spot. Another guy that I didn't mention that I think could slide into that Ali Gay type role is Quincy Wiggins, second-year player. He was a borderline 5-star guy last year on a number of different outlets. So you could see different avenues for this. I think Savion Jones is going to play a lot. They really trusted him, I think, as the season went on to be a good complement for those guys. And now he could be asked to fill a bigger role now that he's, a couple of years seasoned into the program. So certainly can't forget about the new guy or the returning guys that have been on the roster for a while. I think that that's where this program has got to be built on. Coach Kelly said it a number of times. You can't keep bringing in transfers to take over the jobs of guys that are returning that maybe just haven't developed as quickly as you would like. You've got to have reps left over for those guys to continue developing the right way, and how you do that is for them to see the field in times like this during the spring. So I'm going to be interested to see how all that shakes out.
Yeah, a guy like Quincy Wiggins, you talked about Savion Jones as well. How can they step up, maybe fend off some of this competition that's coming in from the outside? You talked about linebacker, that jack position as well. You mentioned those names, and props to you. You nailed. I wasn't even going to try the Ovi's last name, and you just went out here and just nailed it
I
immediately and
tried.
went out with it. So we'll keep talking linebackers here. Look, we know who Harold Perkins is. We know what he can do. Opposing offenses are going to scheme for him on the field. So before we talk about some of the other names, Glenn, I mean, what should we expect out of Harold Perkins in year two and heading into the spring? What are some things that maybe in year one that I know they let him play, just be an athlete at times. What does he need to do to become even better player in year two and on his career?
Yeah, so I think probably the biggest thing for Perkins, you're going to see him all over the field, just in terms of versatility wise, right? I mean, he was a guy last year they really liked, kind of in a jack role, but not really a jack role. They tried to figure out ways to get him and Ojulari on the field together, and he was really kind of strictly an outside linebacker, that kind of would line up really directly next to Ojulari. He would be a guy you could drop in coverage in the slot, because he's really quick and fast as well. But primarily, he's a guy that you're going to use to rush the passer and get into the backfield. Um, and whether that's as an interior linebacker or as a jack linebacker, a outside linebacker, whatever you want to call him, he's going to be on the field every snap next year. He needs to be, and he's going to be a guy that's going to get into the backfield and make defenses, pay. Honestly, I think they're going to find matchups for him to utilize. I think a lot of their defensive schemes has got to go through him and his ability to be able to create some havoc in the backfield. And so, we'll figure out more about that this spring. But I think the unleashing of Harold Perkins is what we're going to see more of in year two. Year one, they didn't want to put too much on his plate in terms of scheme and concept and all that stuff. They just, like you said, they wanted him to go out there and be an athlete and not have to think too much about stuff. And he did that in spades, and he won them a lot of games. I mean, that Arkansas game in particular comes to mind where the offense didn't really play well, but he was consistently in the backfield, and just creating big time stops throughout the entire game that afternoon. You want to see that continue into next year, and they're going to find ways to get him involved. I'm sure of it, and I think he's going to be in for an All-American type season. I think he'll probably be one of the more hyped defensive players in the country, and I'm excited to see how they scheme him up this year.
Now, what's going to help with his ability to roam around and make plays a lot like he did last year is, to me, one of the better additions. It was Omar Spates. This is a guy that comes in from Oregon State. We talked about it multiple times already. A guy that has a lot of football game experience. And I think when you're looking in the portal, and we talked about this last week, the secondary doesn't have a ton of football game experience. This group does necessarily. This is a guy that does, especially in Spates. You have Greg Penn Jr. You have the Weeks brothers. You have Wes Weeks that transferred in, new true freshman Whit Weeks. You have Braithwaite as well, another guy. When you look at this group, they lost Mike Jones Jr. They lose Micah Baskerville. Where did they look other than Harold Perkins? Is it the veteran Omar Spates? Or does another one of these guys, when we mentioned with the defensive line, a returner or maybe a true freshman kind of step up in that role and early on make a difference?
Yeah, I think it's going to be Omar Spates and Greg Penn that'll be the main inside linebackers. That just makes the most sense. You mentioned you also, I mean, Demario Tolan's a guy that left too, and you were hoping he would be a huge part of the program. But he left for Auburn after his true freshman season. And so now I think you're in a position now where you needed to add a guy like Spates, somebody who is a veteran, who's played for 4 years, who's been a starter for several years, hundreds of tackles under his belt, lots of big time game performances. I think he was honestly one of the bigger pickups via the portal or freshman class for this group in particular, because if you are going to be a championship kind of team like LSU aspires to be, you have to have somebody in the middle of the field who's been there, done that, who's played a lot, has a lot of experience, won't be thrown off by many coverages or anything that he sees offensively. That's going to be really, really important. And you were looking at a potential scenario there where Greg Penn, and I love Greg Penn. I think he's a great player, but I'm not sure that he's the kind of guy that you want to really trust that much level of confidence in terms of being able to dish out and recognize all these different coverages that are being thrown at you. Spates is a guy that's going to be able to do that for you, and it's going to allow Greg Penn to roam free a little bit more, use his athletic ability to his advantage. And I think those two guys are going to run with that inside linebacker spots. Whether or not it's Perkins that gets some looks at inside linebacker as well. He's a guy that I think everybody around here believes can certainly play that position and drop in coverage and be able to create fumbles and interceptions in the middle of the field, as well as getting into the backfield. So really like the kind of the versatility there. You mentioned the Weeks brothers. Wes is a guy who's a bit thumper of a player. He just every time he's out there, he's getting a hard hit, and he played a really important kind of complementary role for the games that he was out there. But he also was a guy that battled some injuries, and so figuring out that depth chart is going to be extremely important. But I think that you have a good nucleus of Spates, Penn, and Perkins that you can really rely on. And see what happens with the spring. Does Weeks come out and show you that he can be a really big time player for you in year one? They've had a lot of those kinds of guys, last year with Perkins and certainly with Mason Taylor and a lot of the freshmen that they relied on. And I think Weeks is a guy that can certainly do that and be an anchor of this defense as the season winds on.
And as we kind of wind down today's episode, I want to kind of cap it off with this. We talked about secondary and the kind of the rebuilt secondary in the last episode. Today we talked defensive line, and I mentioned this earlier in the episode as too. I sit in the camp of where if LSU is going to have a lot of success this year, we're going to need to see what this defense looks like really early on. That game against Florida State, against a veteran quarterback and Jordan Travis, when that game comes around, we're going to see what this defense is made of and how well they have gelled. How well do these guys understand their assignments? And like you said, how does this depth chart shake out? So, Glenn, I want to ask you this. Which group are you more interested in watching? Which group is there more maybe a sense of urgency of saying these guys got to play together, these guys have to step up the challenge? Is it the secondary, or is it what we talked about today, maybe this front seven, and which has a bigger impact, in your opinion, on how LSU fares in 2023?
I think everything has to start in the trenches, and I think the front seven is going to be the most important part here. Secondary wise, I think you brought in enough variety to piece those players together in terms of young guys and transfers. I think that they have the talent to be able to hold up in the back end, and it's going to make life a lot easier on them if this front seven can get continuous pressure on the quarterback and also shut down run lanes and that kind of thing. So I'm looking at this defensive line, how that gets pieced together. We know Harold Perkins is going to play a lot. We know Maason Smith's going to play a lot. Mekhi Wingo is going to play a lot. But who else outside of those three in the front seven really steps up is going to be really, really important to follow this spring. I think Omar Spates is a guy that you're going to see a lot of on the field, just in terms of being a reliable presence there and not make a ton of mistakes. I think you could take any one of those transfers and I think any of them can really kind of come in and this spring that they are reliable. But if you really want to get to the crux of what they're going to do, I think it's going to have to lie with some of these freshmen. I think Dashawn Womack is a guy that if he hits right away, you're looking at a really special kind of season in terms of him being able to rush the passer and the compliments that he can give you with those guys on the interior. I think if he hits when he gets here, that's going to be a game changer for LSU in the front seven. So I'm really going to be looking hard at that group, particularly on the defensive line, to see how all that shakes out.
Spring practice does start this week. It's finally here, and the weather's going to be nice, Glenn. From what I can tell, it's going to be a nice little spring practice to kick off. They go Thursday and Friday this week, and then they have off for spring break, and then they come back the week after. And I know Sonny Ship put on our board, Glenn, they're kind of spacing it out a little bit. Can you give us any information on kind of what it could look like, maybe the parameters? I know it's not set in stone yet.
Yeah, so we'll have two practices this week, Thursday and I believe Saturday. Maybe it's Friday, but I think it's Saturday. And then they'll go into a week of spring break. They'll come back, and they kind of divide it up into kind of sections every week. I think they'll have two practices 1 week, 3 1 week, 2 1 week, and then 3 to kind of close it out with the spring game on April 22nd. So you're looking at, a couple on-field practices. Look, they're going to be working out. They're going to be in meeting rooms, everywhere in between there. So this is just strictly on the field work that they're going to be able to get on the practice field. But yeah, I think that you're looking at a group that's going to be able to kind of parcel this out the way that they want. They've obviously spent a lot of time planning this schedule, and we recently just got it. So we're excited. I think there's a lot of excitement around this group, a lot of excitement around kind of the questions that are up in the air, both offensively and defensively. I think there are question marks, but there's also a lot of returning talent that you can be really excited about. And I think that what this coaching staff proved last year is that they can make it work with new guys. And I think if the fact that you have enough of a foundation from last year that they're already working from ahead, a lot of these guys that are in these rooms, they've seen what it's like to, turn in the nutrition stat or the nutrition paper that they fill out every morning, that kind of thing, where they're building the daily habits. They've been a part of that now for over a year. And I think that that's going to rub off obviously on these newcomers. And I think you're working at a much more advantageous position from last year. And I think it's going to pay really good dividends for this group heading into spring.
It's a word that's used a lot, maybe overused, but the word culture is definitely continuing to be established down in Baton Rouge. He's Glen West. My name is Bryce Koon. Thanks so much for watching. If you're on the YouTube page, go ahead and make sure you hit that subscribe button, like the video, and let us know. This is a big position group that we've been previewing here today. And what do you think? Is it going to be a group that is really going to gel together? How quickly? And maybe we missed a name that you want to hear from or you want to see take a big step in 2023. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is the Go 24/7 podcast. We'll catch you on the boards. We'll catch you on the forums and on the social media avenues. Make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and everywhere else. We'll see you